Hey DIYers, what's going on? Mike Borders with the Mike Borders channel. Thank you for watching. We're doing a full rebuild on our lower unit, Cruiser specifically. In today's video, we're going to show you how we remove a bearing and a reverse gear from the actual bearing carrier that comes out of the actual lower unit. Let's get started. All right, DIYers, at the workstation now, and again, we're going to remove a bearing and gear from a bearing carrier that goes inside a lower unit. And here is the puller that we are going to use. Rented this for about $70 from our local AutoZone. And scrolling above right now is a link to a video that gives a full review on this exact hammer puller or slide hammer. Definitely check that out. However, to the lower case, again, we're doing a full rebuild. And here is our bearing carrier. And DIYers, this was by far the hardest part I have ever had to remove from a boat or jet ski, anything marine really. And what we realized is the outdrive experienced some heavy overheating, and that bearing carrier basically melted and seized to the inner portion of the case. Not fun. We had to drill quite a lot of holes to finally break it loose and pull it out. However, from here we're going to take it out, we're going to insert it in the swivel vise and put the slide hammer to use. And here's a better view of the bearing carrier removed from the plastic bag. And here's the reinforced portion, as you can see right there. That is what we are going to grab with the vise to hold this bearing carrier in place while we remove the bottom gear and bearing. Next, I went ahead and removed the lower unit and stand from the workbench to give me better room to use that slide hammer. And again, the reinforced portion of the bearing carrier will be locked in the vise. In addition, to alleviate any grease or grime or debris getting down on the floor, I put a piece of cardboard. And we're just going to open up the vise, and we're going to come in at an angle and lock it in place in a position where not only the thrust ring, but also the gear can rotate smoothly when this vise is locked. Again, the gear and thrust washer can rotate efficiently and freely. The last thing you want to do is apply pressure to this thrust washer and gear, which ultimately will actually make it just a little bit more difficult to pull out. Now let's grab the slide hammer. Now to a closer look at the bearing carrier secured in the vise, and here is the teeth portion that is going to go inside the center hole of the gear and loop around the gear and bearing and grab onto it and allow us to pull it out. And you'll notice each of these little bars have a hooked tooth on it, as you can see here. And you're going to want to make sure that you have everything loosened up. As you can see, I can move all of these freely. We are now going to scrunch all of the teeth together as shown here, and we are going to carefully insert it inside the center portion of the gear. And from here, we're just going to let it rest. We are going to grab the slide hammer, and you'll notice a threaded portion, and we are going to align the thread without cross-threading it, and we are going to screw this in. And as you screw this entire bar in, it is going to help extend the teeth inside the bearing carrier and grip onto that gear. What I'll do is push it forward just to alleviate it from spinning, and just be patient. It'll take a few minutes. And it is now making contact, and I'll pull that back just to ensure that it is gripping on the inner portion of the gear, and I will continue screwing this in as hand tight as I possibly can. And it looks like that's the stopping point. I'll slide the hammer to the rear, and I'm now going to secure each of these bolts and nuts. And in our case, it looks like they came with 1/2-inch nuts and bolts. And DIY is a very important step to ensure, again, this rod goes all the way through this center brace or mount and applies pressure to the internal rods with the teeth to, again, extend them out so they can grab a hold of the inner portion of the gear and bearing. In addition, make sure all of your bolts and nuts are tight. I'll carefully let that slide down. And one more thing I want to mention prior to pulling this gear and bearing out. In the event that the bearing itself gets disconnected from the gear, no matter what, no ifs, ands, buts about it, the bearing must be replaced. And that is per the service manual. So from here, all I'm going to do is use the slide hammer by shifting it up to this point, which is the stopping point. And by doing that, it will apply some heavy outward pressure to the internal bearing and gear. And I'll do my best to not get in your way. There we go. That's all it took. So there is the bearing. You can see where the actual teeth grabbed a hold of the inner bearing. And again, the thrust ring and gear. That's all it took. Can't do it by hand, but using this slide hammer is incredible. Now to a close-up of the actual bearing carrier. Again, make sure it is secured in that vise prior to using that slide hammer. and the inner portion of the carrier where the bearing and gear slide into. And at the opposite end is additional bearings and oil seals. And again, this bearing carrier was extremely difficult to pull out. It was completely melted and seized to the inner case. And let me give you a better close-up here. We destroyed this thing. And all I'm going to do now is loosen up the bolts and nuts and carefully remove this entire slide hammer and bar from the gear and bearing. And one correction real quick, the inner teeth actually grab a hold of the base of the gear, not touching any portion of the bearing. I just wanted to mention that. And here it is, all hooked up. And as mentioned, I used the ratchet, socket, and wrench to loosen up the bolts and nuts, and I'll carefully start unscrewing the long slide hammer rod, and that will release the pressure inside here and allow these bars to compress. And there it is. As you can see here, I'll put this back in the box and I'll shift this aside. Again, DIYers, this is the reverse gear that attaches to the bearing carrier, and this is the thrust ring, and on the back side that is your bearing. And as you can see here, it's still in pretty good condition. If I hold this and spin the reverse gear, it works just fine. However, we are doing a full rebuild and we are going to have a brand new bearing as well as reverse gear. However, you may not be replacing your gear nor your bearing or your thrust ring. So at this point, you can basically use a press and install this in the bearing carrier, or in our case, we took everything to our local marina and they're going to press everything together to ensure that it is perfectly to factory specifications. Taking a step back, and DIYers, that is it. Do us a favor, below the video, you will see that thumbs up icon. Click on that, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Definitely ring your YouTube bell. That would be very helpful to us. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for watching.